Hi, everybody. This is part one of module number 9. In this section, we're going to be talking a little bit about what motivated these men to keep fighting. We saw in our last module that by the fall of 1862, the war was really beginning to evolve. Both sides had expected it to end quickly. Both had sought a big, decisive battle that would end things once and for all. But even though Union forces had made some progress out west, their attempts in the east to capture Richmond had failed. In the process, the Confederacy had landed upon their primary commander, Robert E. Lee, but the Union has been struggling with its leadership. And by the fall of 1862, the Union's starting to reevaluate its approach to the war. Initially, Union officials had thought that secession was just something that was being pushed by the Southern slaveholding elite, and that the population in the South, the ordinary people, didn't really support it. What they're finding through these battles and campaigns throughout the South is that that's not the case, that in fact many ordinary Southerners do support secession. And so that's leading them to reevaluate their thinking and their approach. And then finally, the destruction and the casualties and the loss of life have really shocked both the North and the South. And I think for us, this raises some important questions. What motivated these men to sign up in the first place? What motivated them to fight, and what kept them motivated over the long term, to keep fighting, knowing that they might die, seeing their friends, their brothers, their relatives giving their lives and still being willing to go out and do it themselves. As far as volunteering, particularly for men in 1861 at the start of the war, there's certainly a sense of honor or duty. This is really bound up, I think, with 19th century ideas about manhood and masculinity. You don't want to look like a coward. You don't want your own reputation to be damaged, but you don't want to shame your family's honor and reputation either by not going out and doing your duty. So this idea of needing to join up to prove their manhood, I think, is very much tied in with the sense of personal honor as well as familial honor. Certainly adventure was a big part of it too. In 1861, both sides were eager to go to war. There was this fervor that's sometimes been called a rage militaire. The perception here was that the war was going to be over quickly, so men were really eager to be a part of it, and you didn't want to miss it. You didn't want to miss the defining moment of your generation. These men, they were eager to, as they put it, see the elephant, this exotic beast that you can never really understand unless you experience it yourself. And a lot of these guys were farm boys. This is a chance to get away from home, to experience something exciting and new. They're really seeing the glamorous side of the military and of war. They're not really seeing the carnage aspects of it. And this excitement is all well and good until the bullets start flying, though. And then these men are going to experience what combat it truly is. And they find that it's not the pretty uniforms and the waving flags and the girls kissing them on the cheek as they go off to war. So the question becomes, what kept these guys going under fire? What motivated them in combat situations? And I think the simple fact is that many of these men weren't motivated. A lot of men actually found ways to avoid the front or avoid fighting, or they would just maybe wander off until the fight was over. Oh, my stomach's not feeling good, I'll be over here. The Union Army actually resorts to special units of provost marshals. These are special units whose job it was to keep their own men going forward. So they would actually be stationed in the rear, and their directions would be to basically shoot anybody who's going the wrong way. There's also the threat of punishment, being punished for desertion or dereliction of duty, things like that. And punishment for this could be disfiguring, it could involve whipping, it could involve being executed for desertion. So using coercion to keep men motivated to do their jobs. Alcohol could certainly be a coping mechanism, liquid courage, although not, I think, actually to the extent that we might expect. Religion was definitely a motivating factor. These were some of the most religious armies in American history. There were major religious revivals that swept through both armies. For some of these men, it was the sense that God would protect them. And so they weren't afraid to go out and do their duty because they felt that they had this kind of divine backing. For others, it was a sense of fatalism. You know, if it's my time, if it's God's will, I can't do anything about it. So why should I be afraid? And I think for men on both sides, there was also this sense that their cause was righteous, that God is on our side, that sort of thing. So that's also going to give them motivation to keep going. There's also a big dose of peer pressure and community pressure in all of this. These units that men are fighting in are typically composed of men from the same neighborhood or the same towns. They're fighting alongside friends, family members, neighbors. These are men who know each other very well, and they know each other's families. These guys, they're writing a lot of letters back home. And sometimes these letters are going to get shared with local newspapers. So these men want to prove themselves. They want to demonstrate their honor to their home community, or at least not dishonor. You know, you don't want to be that guy that people are writing letters to back home saying, oh, Joe was a coward and he didn't do his job when we started to advance. So you have to keep proving yourself to your buddies and to your family back home. There's this kind of feedback loop here. As the soldiers and the home communities kind of rely on each other to keep their morale up. Leadership is also going to play a really important part here in motivating men, particularly company level officers. So the lieutenants and the captains. And it was not easy to be a Civil War officer. You know, most of these guys have no formal military training. They might have read a book about tactics if you're lucky, but probably not even that. And at least in the early stages of the war, enlisted men would elect their company officers. You know, they tended to elect men who were kind of the social elites or respected men who had, you know, connections and so forth. But think about that. If officers are elected by their men, that can make it really hard for an officer to impose the kind of discipline that's necessary to shape these men into effective fighting units. If the men don't like you, they can vote you out. In general, soldiers, and I think this is true today as well, they tend to respect and follow officers who share their burdens and who lead by example. You know, demonstrating your bravery under fire, for example. Many of these company officers are expected to lead their men from the front and motivate them through personal bravery. The problem with that is that if you lead from the front, you're likely to get killed. So we actually see a pretty high casualty rate amongst many of these company officers, captains and junior lieutenants. And then finally, this idea of group cohesion, fighting for your buddies. Combat studies of World War II veterans claim that World War II soldiers weren't really that ideologically motivated, that they were fighting for their comrades, their brothers in arms. Similar studies of Civil War soldiers have suggested something a little bit different. That yes, these guys were fighting for their buddies, but that they were actually committed to a cause. And that cause ultimately was what kept them willing to go out and fight and die, even in the face of such carnage, even when their buddies had been killed, and that group cohesion starts to fall apart. The interesting thing that we find from reading these soldiers' letters and diaries is that men on both sides, Union and Confederate, actually claim to be fighting for very similar reasons. Men on both sides see themselves as upholding the legacy of the American Revolution. They say we're fighting now in 1861 for the same reasons that our ancestors fought back in 1776. But the aspects of the revolution that these two sides are looking to are not quite the same. For the North, it's about preserving the Union that came out of the revolution, as well as the rule of law. Northerners are arguing that their ancestors sacrificed to build this republic. Some of them gave their lives. We can't now just let secessionists tear this Union apart. So we need to preserve that legacy for future generations. This is the case that Lincoln makes at the outset of the war. And notice that it actually has very little to do with slavery at this point. For the South, they see themselves in the same vein as the colonists resisting tyrannical British rule. They think that the North represents a direct threat to slavery. And Lincoln was elected without any Southern support, and they believe that he's going to abolish their slave property. For Confederates, They see themselves fighting for liberty and slavery at the same time. It's a terrible contradiction, but one that they don't necessarily pick up on. The fact that they're fighting for their liberty as white men to hold other human beings as slaves. And it's a contradiction that we can see, but which they don't really grasp fully. The South's perspective on the revolution has everything to do with slavery. I mean, their politicians explicitly say so in their ordinances of secession, but they're framing it in the context of the American Revolution. The Confederate cause doesn't really change over the course of the war, but the Emancipation Proclamation is going to have a profound impact on the Union's war aims and its purpose for fighting. And as we'll see here a little bit later in this module, it's also going to generate a real crisis of conscience amongst a lot of white Northerners and within the Union Army.